Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. So if you're new here, my name is Coach Hall. I am an AP Lang teacher, almost said tutor. I do both. I teach and I tutor, and I'm from Arkansas. And my goal is to help AP Lang students prepare for the upcoming exam. So if you're just joining and you have any questions about AP Lang, let me know in the comments. I would love to talk about how you can help to prepare for the exam, and I'd love to answer any questions you have about what to do to study or what to know about the class. So welcome if you're just joining. Feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comments. So the exam is like a little less than 2 months away at this point. So a lot of students, I think, are probably wondering, like, what can I do to prepare? What do I need to know? So while we're waiting for some questions in the comments, let's kind of talk about what the exam is actually going to be like. Fix your lashes? Okay. So I would say the first thing you need to know about the exam is that it's going to have two parts. So the first part is going to be multiple choice. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. For the multiple choice part, you're going to have 5 passages to read. So the first 2 are going to be reading. These are usually longer passages. They're going to be nonfiction. So you're not going to get any like poems or anything like that. It's possible that one's going to be contemporary and one might be a bit older. We don't really know because unfortunately, as teachers, we don't get to see the multiple choice. We only get to see like what's on AP Classroom. But you'll have 2 reading passages, approximately 10 to 13 questions per passage. These usually take students a little bit longer, in my opinion. And then it shifts to the writing questions. Those are my personal favorite on the multiple choice because they're a little bit easier. They're kind of like editing questions. And so those passages are all going to say this is a draft. And it's more about like transitions and possibly word choice, reorganizing the paragraph, things like that. So you have 1 hour to answer those 45 questions. Oh, someone just sent a rose. Thank you, Lily. I think that's my first one, actually. So thank you so much. Yeah, so if you're just joining, go ahead and ask your questions in the chat. Someone asked if they're SAT length. They sort of are. Like, I'd say they're pretty comparable. The College Board also makes the SAT. I think it's like a different committee that does it, but they're pretty comparable, I would say, in terms of length. They're like, you're going to get like a couple columns of text usually. And then like the questions are pretty similar. The only difference I would say is that on the SAT, there's going to be sometimes they'll ask you like what's the best evidence for the previous question. They don't do that on AP Lang, but you can actually use the SAT to study for AP Lang. Do NPCs grade the test? Okay, so I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that acronym. But let me tell you how it's scored. So, like teachers that are trained readers, so it's either a high school AP Lang teacher or it's some of them are college professors that teach like a concurrent credit level class, like College 1, College English 1, Comp 1, that kind of thing. Most of us are high school English teachers, though. And there's requirements, like you have to have taught the class for a certain amount of time, you have to go through training, things like that. So the essays are scored by people, and one person scores like one essay type. So like my first year as a reader, I only read question 2. Last year was kind of weird because we all started on one question and then they rotated us through all of them. But that was like for very random, weird circumstances that I don't think are going to ever happen again. But normally you're on like one question the whole time. So like if I read somebody's question 2, I'm not reading their question 1 or their question 3. But as far as like the multiple choice, from what I heard, it's scored by like a computer kind of thing. I'm not entirely sure because I just know that it's not like a reader that's doing it. The readers only do the essays. Let's see, what other questions do we have? Thank you so much to those that shared the live. I really appreciate it. And welcome anybody who's joining. My name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, and I am here to help you prepare for AP Lang. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I go live each Sunday around 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central for about an hour. And I'm going to be going live like as the exam gets closer. This Monday on YouTube on Tim Friedis's channel, The Garden of English, I'll be going live with him. We'll be talking about like multiple choice and probably starting to talk about one of the FRQs. We have 4 sessions planned. So if you're available Monday at, let me see what time it would be. I think it's 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm on Central Time, so I always have to think about what it is in Eastern Time. We're going to be live on his channel. I keep consistently getting 3s for evidence and commentary. Any tips for a 4? Yes. Okay. So here's the thing. First of all, a 3 is not bad. That's kind of like our minimum goal that we have is getting a 3. But I can understand it's frustrating when you keep getting 3s and you want to get a 4. So for me, the big difference is consistency. Usually when I see an essay that scored a 130, it's because one paragraph did its job, so to speak, but maybe the other ones didn't. And remember, you just need 2 body paragraphs. It's okay if you do 3, but you need usually a minimum of 2. And so usually when an essay scores a 130, what I'm looking for is where did it kind of like get off track? Like maybe a claim was not as developed with evidence and commentary. This could be because the student ran out of time. I've seen that a lot. Like I've seen unfinished essays, and that's okay. We view them as a rough draft, but it could be that one of your paragraphs was noticeably stronger than the other. So if that's the issue, then I would say to get to a 4, you want to figure out which paragraph it is that was weaker. For whatever reason, and really work on your commentary for that paragraph, because it's usually commentary that is going to change your score. There's obviously exceptions to this, but chances are if you're getting 3s, it means you're being inconsistent. So there's a couple things I would have you ask yourself. If you are trying to do 3 body paragraphs, are you taking on too much for 40 minutes? Like, is it possible that you would do better if you had 2 body paragraphs and you developed those equally well instead? And then like the other thing would be like, I guess it kind of depends on which essay we're talking about. But I would just really look at your commentary. Like, are you really developing one claim, but not the other? Like, is there a spot where you're only having like 1 sentence of commentary or 2, and it's just kind of falling flat? Or maybe it's like not as thorough. That would be another reason that it could like possibly limit your score. But yeah, the big difference from a 130 to a 140 is the consistency of the development, especially the commentary. Thank you so much for the likes as well. I really appreciate that. So, and for those of you who are maybe at like I get a 120 and I'm trying to get a 130, my tip for that would be to make sure one of your paragraphs is really strong. Because based on the wording of the rubric, you really need to address the prompt thoroughly. And so one paragraph could elevate your score. So if you're trying to get from like a 2 to a 3 in row B, the evidence and commentary row, figure out which paragraph you could write better and really put your thoughts into that paragraph. Because usually with a 120, we see a lot of like limited commentary where it's like really simplistic, or like the commentary is kind of like bland. Like it's just kind of like things like, oh, this opens the reader's eyes, or this helps society, or things like that. But it's not really digging into like the deeper meaning. So if you're struggling with commentary, there's a couple things you can do, and this will apply to all 3 essays. These are quick fixes, by the way. So one is to use the word because commentary is analysis. It's the why. So if you are struggling with your commentary, add the word because, and then keep going with your sentence. You can also use transition words. This can be really helpful to develop your commentary as well. So 2 that I'm trying to work with my students on right now are consequently and subsequently, because it's kind of creating like a cause and effect type relationship. You can also use other ones like furthermore, additionally, therefore, but those transition words really help develop a line of reasoning as well. Okay, so we have a question over here on YouTube. Are there any particular literary or rhetorical devices I should focus on this far in the year? Okay, so that's a really good question. A lot of students ask this question in different ways, especially for rhetorical analysis. It's like, okay, which ones do I need to know? And I love this question, and I also hate this question as a teacher. So let me tell you why. I love this question because it shows that you're trying to be prepared, and it shows that you're trying to think strategically. I also sort of hate this question, and not hate in a bad way, but I hate this question because sometimes what happens is when I give kids a list, that's all they look for. And so, like, let me give you a quick anecdote, a quick story to tell you what I mean by this. For whatever reason, a couple years ago, a lot of the passages that I chose had juxtaposition in it, which is contrast. And so I had a student who we were doing an assignment where they had to read and annotate, and he called me over and he's like, Coach Hall, I can't find the juxtaposition in this. And I was like, wait, what? Why are you looking for that? And he was like, oh, the FRQs are, yes, there's 3 of them. I'll get to that in a second. Great question. He's like, I can't find the juxtaposition. And I was like, well, there isn't necessarily going to be juxtaposition. Why are you looking for it? So juxtaposition is contrast. And he was like, well, we had it in every other passage you gave us for the past couple weeks, so I just figured it had to be there. So that's why I am hesitant to give a list, because people just look for only those things. But here are the ones that I tell my students to look for frequently. First of all, word choice and tone are going to be in everything. My students have sometimes asked, like, what's worst case scenario? Like, what if they give us a passage and we don't understand it, or we can't find the choices in it? What do we do? Well, there's always word choice, and word choice creates tone. So you can look for that. So you want to be thinking about, like, what type of words they're using. Like, is it really patriotic words? Are they somber words? Are they really harsh words? Like, how would you describe it? So word choice and tone is definitely something that should be on your list, because it's there for everything. I don't actually encourage my students to analyze syntax, because it's there, yes, but I feel like students struggle to write about it well. So I don't teach that as much. But if your teacher does teach that and you feel confident with it, then definitely do that. Hey, AP Bio. So yeah, definitely, like, I don't emphasize syntax as much, but some teachers do. Repetition is very frequent as well. So if you know how to write about that well, it can be meaningful, because if you're looking at the repetition, you can also look at the word choice, right? Because if they're repeating a certain word or phrase, then why are they repeating that particular word? So you can get more commentary out of it. So it's not just like, oh, they repeat the word we. That's great, but why is the word we important to that audience? It's probably very inclusive. They're probably trying to show that they're connecting with the audience. So you can look at, like, word choice and repetition together. Something else that's really common for students to try to analyze would be the appeals. I have a video about this on my channel, because what I hate to see, it makes me cringe, is I hate to see a paragraph about logos and then one about ethos and then one about pathos, because they're not all 3 equally present in all texts. Thank you so much for the likes on TikTok, by the way. So I'm not saying you can't write about them. What I am saying is, don't go into your essay assuming that you need one paragraph about each one, because choices create appeals. So instead of writing about logos, which is logic, then try to write about, like, what is actually making it logical. So facts, statistics, examples. Those would be the choices that I would recommend. So we can add those to our list as well. So we have word choice and tone. We have repetition. We have facts, statistics, or examples, because those are usually logical. An example could be emotional as well. We've got, let's see, like, detail. In rhetorical analysis, we tend to say detail and not imagery, but they're kind of the same thing. So detail or description can be really important, and that can usually create an emotional appeal. So that would be something I would encourage you to know as well. Less common, but still potentially important, would be comparisons, because it could be like a metaphor. I haven't really seen similes very often, if I'm being honest, but just comparison in general, or contrast. So I mentioned earlier juxtaposition. That's just a fancy word for contrast. So that would be another one. And then anecdotes. So Anecdotes. The reason why I'm spelling it is because sometimes people hear the word antidote, like medicine, and that's not what we're talking about. So an anecdote is a, like, short story as evidence, like, it's kind of helping prove the point. And so sometimes they'll give, like, one anecdote or a couple short ones, and they're usually personal stories. Sometimes they're meant to be funny, not always though. But those can help convey the message as well. So less common, they're kind of like a medium one. Yes. Yeah, because so many people hear antidote, and I've seen kids write it. And so if you accidentally write, like, the wrong word, like if you say antidote instead of anecdote, like, if we know what you're talking about, it's fine. But I have a lot of students who, when they first hear me say that, they're like, wait, like the medicine? Like, no, not the medicine. But if you're not sure if it's like an actual anecdote, just call it an example, and that's totally fine. Another one that's maybe I don't want to say it's not as common. It just might be harder to write about meaningfully is questions. A lot of students want to write about the rhetorical questions, but sometimes if there's just one rhetorical question, then it's hard to write like a whole paragraph about that. But if they're asking like a series of questions, that might get you more to analyze. And I tell my students, call it a question, not a rhetorical question, because not all questions are rhetorical, but all questions are questions, if that makes sense. So that would be another one. There is a video on my channel. It's on my list to update. I'm actually going to write myself a note now. Update choices video, because it is one that I need to update. The info's still good. I just made that video back in 2020, and it's like the top choices you need to know for the AP Lang exam. I think I made it like the night before that year's test because I had so many requests for the video and I was like sleep deprived trying to make this video. So I'm sure there's probably a couple typos in it, but the info is still good. So I will update that video, but there is a video on my channel that has like the top choices as well. But those are the ones I would recommend knowing. But remember too that a choice can be something that the writer is doing. So flattery is a choice. They're doing that on purpose. Humor is a choice. They're doing that on purpose. Creating a common enemy is a choice. We talk about that in my class when we do FDR speech. So he does like a bunch of different things, but like with his word choice and all that, but it's to create an enemy. So if you can like say what they're doing, you don't have to tie it to a device. So just kind of keep that in mind as well, because students kind of wonder, like, what if I don't see anything? Do you think that the way teachers grade practice essays during the year are accurate? Well, that's a very interesting question. It really depends. I know a lot of teachers who grade more harshly than they would on the exam. And as a student, I'm sure that could probably be pretty frustrating, but here's why those teachers might be doing that. Two reasons. Number one, if teachers grade their students more harshly, then it's setting you up hopefully for success on the exam. Also, sometimes as teachers, we have different expectations in our classroom for our content area than the actual exam expectations. So if your teacher is thinking about like maybe college level requirements or state requirements or just their own personal desires for good writing, it's possible that they might grade you differently than the exam. I try to really stick to the exam rubric for most cases. But I do know of teachers who, have said like, I might grade more harshly. And so each teacher kind of does what they need to do in their classroom. But I have had students kind of look at released exam samples and be like, wait, that got a 1.3? Like, how did that get a 1.30? Like, I write better than that. And so like, it's also important to remember that there's many ways to get a score on the exam. So like you could get a score of a 1.30 and it could be like barely a 1.30. And then you could get a score of a 1.30 and it could be like super close to a 1.40. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. But and I know some teachers don't even use the rubric during the year. Is creating a common enemy a device? No, it would be a choice. Like there's not like a name for it, like other than creating a common enemy. So it's a choice. So here's the difference, because that's a really good question. They're going to ask you to write about choices. You can write about a device, that's fine. But a choice is a verb and a device is a noun. Now you can actually turn a lot of the devices into a choice. So for instance, if I said repetition, that's a noun device. But if I want to make it into a verb, I just say repeats. So we want you to try to use what we call rhetorically accurate verbs. There's actually probably 3 or 4 different really good lists out there of rhetorically accurate verbs. I don't give those to my students though, because most of these lists have like 50 plus verbs on it. And a lot of them are either verbs that students might not readily use or they might use incorrectly. And a list of 50 verbs, I think, can be really overwhelming. So if you do go look up these like rhetorically accurate verb lists, I would maybe look at the list and try to choose like 10 to 20 that you could readily use, because some of them are only for specific circumstances, or you might not know how to use it like correctly, if that makes sense. So don't get overwhelmed by that. What order do you recommend writing the essays in? This is a really good question. This deals with creating a game plan, in my opinion. I have a video from last year about this, and I'm doing a workshop on it on OutSchool. So if you are interested in that, there's info in my profile. But basically, What I tell my students is to consider a couple things. Play to your strengths. Most of my students, I think honestly, all of my students that I know of in the past have started with synthesis just because that one takes the longest. Um, the College Board has like a recommended reading time of 15 minutes. I tell my students to try to spend about 10 for synthesis sources specifically, because most of my students want more than 40 minutes for rhetorical analysis. And quite frankly, I don't blame them. So most of my students, if not all of them, start with synthesis because that one, it just feels good when you're done with it because it takes a while. Um, I think most of my students take it in order, but that might be because of the type of teacher I am. I really like to teach rhetorical analysis. And so my students feel pretty comfortable with that. Their least favorite usually is argument. So they save that one for last anyway, because for most of them, they consider it their weakest essay. Even if they're good at it, they still just don't like it. Now, I have had some students who are like, rhetorical analysis is not my jam. So they will do it synthesis, argument, rhetorical analysis. So I think as a student, you want to really ask yourself, what are your strengths? Some students might be kind of equal at all essays, in which case I would say on exam day, maybe look at the prompts because they're all going to be in your booklet. So you can look at all 3 prompts at one time and then be like, this one first, this one second, this one third, if that matters. But I tend to advise students to put their stronger essays first because you want to try to do what you can to get a higher score. And the reason why I say this is because my students who, like, let's say they're going to write a 1-2-0 for whatever reason, you could write a solid 1-2-0 in 20 minutes. Like, worst case scenario, if you completely mismanage your time, you can at least get a 1-2-0. You can maybe even get a 1-3-0 with like one fantastic body paragraph in 20 to 30 minutes. So if we know that, we can kind of use that as like a reason to prioritize our strengths. Because I have had students say to me, like, you know what, if I just had 5 more minutes, then I probably could have gone up a point on the rubric and things like that. So that's all the stuff that I try to talk about in the game plan video from last year. There's also some strategy that you can do with multiple choice too. And it's what I'll be talking about in that workshop. If you're interested, it's on OutSchool. The info is in my profile. And of course, we can talk about it here as well. But yeah, prioritize your strengths. I'm just going to scroll up and just make sure I didn't miss anything. Let's see. Okay. Do we have to write 3 body paragraphs to get a 6 out of 6? No. Actually, a lot of my students only do 2 body paragraphs because 40 minutes, it's just hard to write 3 really good, consistent body paragraphs. Now, you will see a lot of 6 out of 6 samples from the College Board that have 3 body paragraphs, but that's not a rule. Like, there is nothing that says you only need or that you must write 3 body paragraphs to get a 6, because you can write 3 body paragraphs and it not be a 6. You can write 2 body paragraphs and it can get a 6. I've even seen one essay that they released for like, I think it was question 3. It was like 3 body paragraphs, or like 3 paragraphs in general, but like the intro was kind of this weird hybrid intro body paragraph. It was a very unique essay, but it was 3 body paragraphs and it still got a 6. So, no, you do not need 3 body paragraphs to get a 6. In fact, I would say, if you are struggling to develop your 3 body paragraphs, consider writing 2. What are the easiest and hardest synthesis prompts you've seen on the exam? The hardest one for my students in recent years has been from, I think it's 2018, eminent domain. Because they didn't know what the topic was. Now, they do tell you in the prompt and in the sources what it is, but a lot of my students were like, what? Like, what is this? So whenever my students ask me for like the hard ones, like the hardest prompts, like literally like the last 3 weeks before the exam, we go through like the hardest prompts in recent years. That is one of them. So I would say that one's hard. My students this year, I gave them last year's STEM prompt and they didn't like it as much. It's not that it was hard, they just didn't like it. So I would say that, like, if it were me and I was trying to study, I would look at the prompts from approximately 2017 to 2022, because those are going to be more of what it's like now. A lot of especially for synthesis, a lot of the prompts from like when they first put it on the exam, which was in 2008, they were using really short sources. Like, if you look, the sources are like this long and you might think, oh, good, there's less to read. Yeah, there's less to read, but there's also less to write about. So I have kind of stopped using some of those older prompts. I think the oldest one I use is maybe 2011 Locavore. My students like that one. That one's pretty easy. So Locavore is kind of easy. I would say Wind Farm from 2019 can be pretty easy. And then there's one that I just like as a teacher because it fits my curriculum. It's the English curriculum synthesis. And I think it's a Form B prompt, which means that it was either on like the makeup exam or international. Don't love the sources as much on that one, but like overall, I teach it each year because it fits with a unit that we do. So those would be my recommendations. But if you're looking for just like, I want to study and I want to prepare for the exam, I would say use pretty current prompts. So like 2017 to 2022. There's a few that I recommend that are from before that, but anything in the last like 5 or 6 years is going to be more calibrated with what you should see on the exam. In 2020, they only did rhetorical analysis. So if you come across those, you'll see 3 samples from that year, but they're all rhetorical analysis, just FYI. Okay, tips for, oops, it scrolled up, hold on. Sorry, tips for synthesis, I think is what it said. Synthesis essay, should it be kind of like an argument essay, just using the sources as evidence? Yes. So that's a good understanding to have, is that a synthesis essay is an argument essay with sources. I personally teach synthesis first because I find it easier for my students. Some teachers do the opposite, and that's totally okay. Some teachers teach argument and then they go to synthesis. But it's an argument essay with sources. Remember, you must use 3. If you are in like AP US history or anything with like a DBQ, it is similar, but it's not exactly the same. So in like APUSH, I'm pretty sure they have to use all the sources. For a synthesis essay, it's just 3. I usually tell my students to try to go for 4 if possible, just in case, but it's not a requirement. It's just kind of like a, hey, try for 4 if you can. You do not get any kind of bonus points if you include all the sources. In fact, like because the sources are so different with their perspectives, if you're trying to somehow include all of them because you think it's going to get you bonus points with your reader, it usually won't. So 3 to 4 sources, make sure you clearly cite them. That makes it so much easier on your reader. You do not need a counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation. A lot of teachers encourage students to do that because it is just a really good argument skill in general. And I personally believe it's a skill that students should know. So I teach my students that skill, but I don't require them to put it in all their synthesis essays. If I do, it's like we talk about it in class and I'm like, hey, for this prompt, I want to see one. Let's plan out what you're going to do. But on the exam, I'm not like, hey, you must have one, because I've seen so many times where it almost feels like the person's forcing it and then it like weakens their essay. If you're going to address the counter argument, generally speaking, I recommend it be last. A couple years ago, I actually used to like to see it first for my students. Because it just kind of felt like it was getting it out of the way. It seemed kind of nice. Many of my students could do that well, but a lot of them were kind of like, hey, I feel like I'm rushing my actual points if I do that. And then as a teacher, I was like, oh, you're right. 40 minutes for, so I kind of basically told them like, hey, let's try it at the end instead. Because if you have 3 body paragraphs and your last one is addressing the counter argument, if you don't get to that, then like you at least have 2 good paragraphs and can still score well. So not required to address the counter argument. Do it if it's going to be helpful. Let's see. On YouTube, we have a question. Are there any online sources you recommend your students make use of in preparation for the exam? Yes. So I assign certain things on AP Classroom. I know not everybody has access to that, but that is one that I like. If you're looking for multiple choice practice, so with a lot of my tutoring students, because I can't use AP Classroom with them, I use SAT release tests for multiple choice practice, and that can be really helpful. There are also some online resources. Marco Learning has a free practice test. You just have to use your email to sign up. So if you're looking for like a free practice test, I have looked at theirs. I think it's strong. I don't have my own, like I have not sat down to make one, so I recommend theirs. And then if you're looking for even further review, Tim Freitas made the ultimate review packet for AP Lang. And I think that one is good. Tim's a good friend of mine. He and I are actually doing a live Monday night. This is the first of 4 lives. We do this every year. We've done it for 3 years now. His work is very high quality, and the ultimate review packet is very reasonable. I don't recommend test prep books because I've had tutoring students that have bought them first, and then they started working with me and we were looking at some of the questions and it was like, that's not how they would phrase it. Or they were like, my score is really low, but like when I took this test from AP Classroom, it was really high. So I haven't found a test prep book that I really like and could wholeheartedly recommend. But those are some like outside sources if you're just looking for practice stuff. And then, of course, if you're just looking for essay practice, I would recommend the past exam prompts. Literally just type in AP Lang past exam prompts and they're there. Okay, let's see. Should we try to develop our own ideas for the synthesis essay? Okay, yes, that does make sense. When I first started teaching AP Lang, they told us like have the kids read the prompt and have them come up with their own position and then look at the sources. And so for the first like year or two of teaching it, that's exactly what I did. Well, let me tell you why I don't do it that way anymore. And I'm not saying it's wrong to, but this is why I don't. So there's this prompt, it's about space exploration. And so I had my sweet little 10th graders at the time do this. And we were like, all right, so we brainstormed all the possible reasons and whatever it could be in relation to the prompt as it was asked. We had like 4 reasons on the board. We made a chart. It was wonderful. Then we started reading the sources. And a lot of the ideas my students had that were legitimately good ideas were not even touched upon in the sources. And my students were like, okay, so what do we do now, Coach Hall? And I was like, guess we need to use 3 sources. So that really limits what we can say here. Now, on the one hand, their ideas that were not referenced in the sources could have been good commentary, I suppose. But that was my moment where I was like, that advice might work for some prompts, but not all prompts. Also, let's take, someone asked earlier, the hardest prompt in recent years, I would say is eminent domain. If you don't fully understand what eminent domain is, it is hard to come up with reasons for or against it, especially under pressure. Because I feel like on the test day, like even if like outside of class, like outside of the test, you could like really rationally be like, oh, well, let's consider this and this. On test day, you could be feeling all kinds of panic and that kind of thing. I hope you don't. But I think it's easier sometimes for students if the topic is unfamiliar or if you're pressed for time. I think it's easier to maybe think of 1 or 2 ideas on your own, just kind of like, here's my gut reaction, but then go to the sources because at the end of the day, you have to construct an argument that's supported by the sources anyway. So that's why I've kind of changed my my perspective on that a little bit. But thank you for those questions. Can you make a list of possible rhetoric we can use in our rhetorical analysis? Do you mean like rhetorical choices or like as in, do you mean when you say possible rhetoric we can use, do you mean rhetorical choices you can analyze or do you mean rhetorical choices that you can make as a writer to try to be more sophisticated? Because I can do both, but those would be separate lists. So just please clarify what you mean by that and then we could talk about that for sure. Could I cite sources by embedding, even though I'm not using them as evidence, just for explanation? Sort of, if I'm understanding you correctly, like if you're trying to somehow get like context info, you can. So you can either direct quote or paraphrase, and technically summary is allowed, but be really careful because we don't want you to summarize the source. But if you need to kind of summarize info from a source or paraphrase it, then yes, that could happen. When my students are going through synthesis, I tend to advise them to look for facts, statistics, and real world examples because those are usually the most logical. So those are the things that they tend to look for. Now, not always, but I find synthesis, you usually want a logical emotion or a logical argument, not an emotional argument. And so if you're trying to figure out like, what do I need from these sources? Any kind of like facts, statistics, real world examples as proof. Expert testimony would be another one. They, in the articles themselves, usually they quote someone who's an expert in some way. So those are the things that I tell my students to look for if they're trying to find stuff to direct quote. Now that's not an all or nothing kind of thing. It's just like, if you're struggling, these are the tips that I would recommend. Let's see. Let me see if that person responded. I don't think so. So if the person who asked about possible rhetoric, if you could just clarify, I can go over like what choices are usually most common, but I wasn't sure by the question if you were asking like what choices you can make as a writer, because someone asked that last week about the sophistication point. So yeah, so if you're just joining, welcome. My name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas. I also do tutoring for AP Lang as well, and I go live each week as the exam nears to help students prepare. So it's Sundays at 3 p.m. Eastern, And I also will be going live on Monday on the Garden of English YouTube channel with Tim Freitas. We're going to be talking about how to prepare for the exam as well. So if you're not following Tim on YouTube, please do so that you can join that as well. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions you have in the comments. I'm happy to answer them as best I can. I will be going live randomly, like as the exam gets closer. People have asked for like a schedule. Because I have two littles, I haven't made an exact schedule yet, but I will be going live more than once a week starting in April. And actually in April, I have like a whole list of like stuff for TikTok specifically where I want to answer some of the most frequently asked questions, like kind of like one a day kind of thing. So if you're not following on TikTok and you want that info, please do so. All right, so feel free to ask any questions you have. We've talked about how to best prepare for the exam. We've talked a little bit about rhetorical analysis, a little bit about synthesis, but I'm happy to revisit any of those topics or answer new questions if you have them. So yeah, just let me know what you're wondering about. I'm surprised no one's asked about sophistication yet because that's usually around this time. That's usually what people want. Tips for argumentative. Okay, great question. So here's the thing. Here's what I think you could be doing now to kind of help for that essay. One thing is argument essays need specific evidence. And so part of what I have my students do around April is I have them make this, I call it a database, but basically I have them think about some historical events, historical figures, contemporary, like current events that they know about well, because you want to be able to have tools in your toolbox, so to speak, things that you can write about well. Because a lot of times students tend to generalize on the exam for like these lower essays. So if you have like, specifics that you could write about well and create really strong evidence for, that can be really helpful. So we don't know what the prompt will be, but if you can kind of think about, okay, I could write about these 5 historical figures really well, or these 5 historical events, or this pop culture reference, that can really help you. For argument, I would say the biggest thing is to make sure that whatever the keywords in the prompt are, make sure that you are understanding the question being asked. Because in the past couple years, I've seen students kind of like take the question that they were supposed to be answering, and then they didn't really address it in the way intended. So for instance, it must have been 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the prompt was, what is the value of striving for perfection? A lot of students that scored a little bit lower wrote about the value of perfection. Well, those are two different things. The value of perfection is different than the value of striving for perfection. So I tell my students, like on exam day, circle or underline the full phrase that you're supposed to write about. And I want to see that phrase in your thesis, and I want to see it once, if not twice, in your body paragraphs. I would venture to say twice. Like make sure that you are tying it back to the prompt, because a lot of times when students are kind of struggling, they kind of go astray and they're not actually answering the question being asked. Now, the other thing besides specific evidence is we need to see commentary. So you want to make sure you're using words like because, consequently, subsequently, therefore, and really thinking about why does this example that I'm writing about matter? So like, what is it showing us? And instead of saying shows, you could talk about like illustrates, highlights, suggests, but think about like the short-term or long-term impact. How does it affect society? Because you chose this example for a reason. Don't assume that we, the person reading your essay, know why you chose it. Like tell us why it's meaningful. And that can really help with argument. But I will say, not that anyone cares, but argument is my least favorite of the 3 essays, just because I feel like for me, I don't like it being so open-ended. Like as a student, like I loved things where it was very concrete. And I have students who are like, I love argument. I can write about whatever I want. But me, I'm like, there's so much to write about. But I also like certain prompts better than others. But rhetorical analysis is my favorite. Let's see. Do you have any tips for getting the sophistication point in the 3 different essays? So yes, each essay, they kind of have like, there's similarities for sure in the rubric. Rhetorical analysis is kind of separate and a little bit from like synthesis and argument though. I actually just posted a video last week on my YouTube channel, an updated video about rhetorical analysis sophistication. So if you want RA specifically, definitely go check out that video for more tips. But I'll tell you some here too. But if you're like, hey, I want more, please go check out my channel. But for rhetorical analysis, the easiest way that I have found, like easiest and like most frequent way that students have gotten the sophistication point, even though it's rare. Like only 5 to 9% of students get it, depending on which essay and exam we're talking about. The easiest way is really connecting to the rhetorical situation. And so what I mean by that is like really analyzing why the speaker is making those choices for that audience on that occasion. So really digging into the why behind what they're doing, really considering, for instance, like who the speaker is and what their credentials are, what is their relationship with the audience, and like why they're tailoring their speech to the audience in that way. Depending on the passage, you might also think about the historical context and like why they're making certain choices given what was going on in the world at the time. So things like that. So I addressed that in that video on my YouTube channel that I mentioned. It should be like, if not my most current video, like the second most current video. So definitely doing that. I also have a pretty current video about rhetorical analysis sentence frames. And if you're like, I get the rhetorical situation, but I don't know how to write about it, there's sentence frames in that video that really help. My students love those. They have learned to make them their own, but like they love the sentence frames. So definitely check that out. The second most common way for rhetorical analysis is, and this one can be really good depending on the passage, is analyzing complexities and tensions. So for instance, some of the prompts more recently that you might be familiar with, where I feel like you could definitely analyze complexity or tension, the Gandhi prompt from 2019, Gandhi's letter to Lord Irwin, definitely a complex relationship between like speaker audience there. Even Abigail Adams from 2014, when she's writing to her son, like mother to son, complex relationship there, because basically her son was on a trip that he didn't want to go on, and she kind of had to balance the "I told you so" with like "do me proud." So definitely a tense relationship there. And then even I forgot what year it was on the exam. I want to say 2011, but I might be wrong. But Banneker's letter to Thomas Jefferson. I just started teaching that one this year. And I really like it because Banneker essentially calls Jefferson a hypocrite without calling him a hypocrite. And I think that's really funny just in terms of the rhetoric there. So that's a really good one to examine complexity as well, because when we read it in class, we talked about how like the different social roles at the time and like how he has to develop his argument without actually getting to say maybe what he wanted to say. But still gets his point across nonetheless. And then Jefferson's response to the letter is like very underwhelming. But that's not part of the passage. But anyway, the point is that you can analyze if there's like a really tense speaker audience relationship, either because it's like a subordinate and their superior, or like mother son, or whatever it is. Or if there's like social tension historically with like different social roles, you can examine that. And the last way you can get it, and I think the least common, is vivid and descriptive writing style. Some tips for this would be eliminate lower level words. So like good, bad, thing, like choose something stronger. Choose hopefully like times where you can like use an appropriate synonym. Sorry, I can't talk, in a meaningful way. Like try to elevate your word choice as you write, but don't just throw in words because they make you sound smart. There are so many times where I've read an essay and I'm like, that person just used the word wrong. Or I had a student, brilliant student from a few years ago, but like her vocabulary was incredibly strong. However, it was like these words were thrown in and it made it almost like distracting. So it's not that I didn't know what the words meant, but it was like too much, right? So we don't want to just throw in words to make ourselves sound smart. Make sure you're using them in a way that is meaningful. But that alone won't get you the sophistication point. But something else you can do to help your style is add in appropriate adverbs and adjectives. So instead of saying like he claims, maybe say like he boldly claims or something like that, or he logically asserts. Like add in adjectives and adverbs to be more precise, to better convey what's happening. That will help your writing style. And then lastly, for style, if you can, learn how to use colons and dashes correctly. If you are studying for the SAT or ACT, this helps for that too, because if you know the rules of it, you get it right on multiple choice for the SAT and the ACT, and then you can incorporate it in your own writing. I do have videos about this on my channel too, if you want to know how to do it correctly. I would also say things like parentheses can be helpful if used correctly, and then like commas to offset extra info. Also semicolons, but I feel like semicolons, people use them wrong a lot. So when a student uses it well and like correctly, I'm like, oh, that's nice. But I don't think a semicolon is as like meaningful in terms of your rhetoric, if that makes sense, as like colons and dashes. When those are used correctly, I'm like, okay, I like this, because it kind of helps you emphasize certain parts of your sentence. So anyway, those are the tips for rhetorical analysis. For synthesis and argument, really quickly, I would say the broader context is the way that students get the point most frequently. So really thinking about like the deeper social implications, short term, long term, maybe connecting it on a global scale. I have seen some students go for like a personal connection as broader context. And like sometimes this works well, sometimes it flops. So you can write about personal experience in Q3, sometimes in Q1 too. Just kind of depends. Can you reference aspects from shows or movies in your argument essay? Yes. Some teachers discourage this. I personally am of the camp of like, what can you write about best in the moment? So if you had to choose between like your favorite TV show that you could tell me about for hours, or like this historical figure that you maybe remember learning about in history, but you don't know all the specifics, if you can make the TV show convincing and you can connect it to your thesis and prove your point, go for that. Because I would much rather have you write about something that you can write about specifically and knowledgeably, as long as you can connect it to the thesis. I would much rather see that than like a really generalized version of history, if that makes sense. But like some teachers really don't like the pop culture stuff. I personally just don't mind it, because I feel like students are more passionate about it when it's stuff that they know. So just my personal opinion. I've actually learned a lot about different like topics, because when students write about what they know, it makes for a much more meaningful essay. So just my personal opinion. Some teachers might differ with that. What would synthesis commentary encompass other than connecting back to the thesis? Really good question. So you want to make sure that you're explaining the significance of your evidence as well. So like, for instance, like sometimes I'll see students bring up, like we talked about this earlier, like facts, statistics, real world examples, or even expert testimony as evidence. That's great. But if you're not explaining why the statistic matters, then it's not helpful. So for instance, on the wind farm prompt, there's like this chart, and it says like wind energy is 1,164% more efficient. Okay, cool. Like that's a great fact. Why does that matter? And like it depends on what you want your argument to be, what you do with that info, but you need to explain like why that matters. So if you're wanting to argue that we should consider the efficiency of this energy, then you could go into talking about how if we were to use this, then we would reduce our dependence on coal and oil. So we could be more financially independent as a country. It's a clean, renewable resource and more efficient. Like, so you can kind of go into the why much better. So a lot of times what I see is students might like provide a fact, statistic, example, or expert testimony, but their commentary just kind of summarizes the fact, or like, so it's like, so this is efficient and therefore it's helpful. Okay, but why? So that's going to be a big thing for your commentary too, is like explaining why the evidence you just put matters. And that's how you're going to try to connect it to your thesis, if that makes sense. Because a lot of times people just kind of summarize their evidence. Thank you so much for the likes on TikTok. I really appreciate that. Oh, we got a question over here on YouTube. I'm sorry if I was ignoring YouTube for a second. What tips best help your students develop a strong line of reasoning in their argument essays? Great question. So there's a couple of things that I try to focus on, especially at this point in the year. One is, don't underestimate the power of your thesis and your topic sentences, because if you can create topic sentences that connect your ideas well, then that's going to create that line of reasoning. It's not like a guaranteed like fix everything kind of situation, but it helps the essay read more smoothly. I have my students really think about the order that they want to put stuff in. So like, which body paragraph main idea needs to come first? Because for some essay prompts, like it makes more sense to put this main idea first and then this one. So that's one of the things that we talk about, is like which idea needs to go first. We also talk about the order of their evidence. So if they're putting two examples in their paragraph, are we doing it in chronological order? Are we going from like a real world example to a personal example? Because those transitions matter. So transitions can really help with line of reasoning as well. So one of the things that I try to really help students with for line of reasoning is having very clear topic sentences and also effective transitions within their paragraph and really thinking about the order. So like if our goal is to be persuasive and convincing, then what is going to be the best order to put this information in? And we do talk about like how to address the counter argument, but I don't require it like all the time. There's certain prompts where I tell my students, yes, I want you to practice this so you know how to do the skill, because I think it's a valuable life skill, but I don't make them do it in timed essays unless they feel like it's going to really help their argument. And I am working on a video for YouTube. I'm hoping to record it today, which realistically means that I can edit it and put it up tomorrow. But I just did a couple weeks ago a rhetorical analysis sentence frames video. And so now I want to do one with my favorite ones for synthesis and argument. So that should be up in the next couple days on my channel. I have more I have more rhetorical analysis sentence frames than argument and synthesis. But I still think there's certain like frames that students could use to help that line of reasoning. So if you're interested in line of reasoning or you just want to know like what sentence frames to use, be on the lookout for that video the next couple days. And if you want one for RA, it's already up on my channel. But yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. I keep trying to scroll on TikTok and it keeps like swiping the wrong way. It's not my friend today. Thank you so much for the likes. We're at 4K likes, 4.4. That's fantastic. Let's see. Okay, how do we apply synthesis in a broader context? Do you have an example? Okay, yes, let me think of one off the top of my head. Okay, so let's use the cursive writing prompt as an example. So broader context. Okay, so we want to think about why this matters. Now, let's say my argument is that schools should focus on print handwriting, but not cursive. Okay, and let's say that my reason why, that we can start to go into the broader context here. We could talk about how in this day and age, students don't necessarily need to know how to write cursive. And we could say that because of COVID, so broader context, students in many schools are one-to-one, meaning like they have their own Chromebook or iPad or whatever it is. And so teachers, instead of spending time with cursive, they could focus on digital technology. Also, because of COVID, we are starting to see gaps in what we call social emotional learning. Now, this might be more of what I know about as a teacher as opposed to what you might know as a student, but go with me on this for a second. So because students were at home doing virtual instruction for 6 months to a year or more, it limited their opportunity to socialize, which is crucial in these younger ages. And so if we want to develop strong citizens who are able to control their emotions and be empathetic, and be ready to learn in a school environment, then we need to focus on building up these skills instead of cursive. So instead of cursive, maybe we should be focusing on more playtime. There's other countries where they barely focus on academics in kindergarten and their test scores are way higher than ours in the US. So anyway, point is, it's like that would be a broader context. So if I connect it to like observations about COVID or other countries don't focus on cursive, they focus on this. And kind of developing that, but you'd have to actually explain it. So you have to have some knowledge about it. And that was kind of like off the cuff, but hopefully that helps you understand broader context. So like I could take, like, let's say one of the sources was talking about like how students need more digital literacy. I could talk about how like now kids definitely need to, like, let's say the article was from 2013 and they're like, yep, kids need better digital literacy. I could be like, yeah, well, in the nearly 10 years since this was published, here's what's happened. And this is absolutely true. We need more digital literacy because, and then kind of connect it to a broader context. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And you could do that in your body paragraphs, and that would be additional commentary, or some students like to do that kind of thing in their conclusion paragraph as well. So hopefully that example made sense. Oops. I saw a question about rhetorical analysis. Let me see. For rhetorical analysis, do you suggest expressing our rhetorical choices in the thesis? Okay, yes, to an extent. Let me tell you why. Okay, so when readers see the choices very clearly in the thesis, well, first of all, in order to be defensible, let me back up. In order to be defensible, there needs to be choices in the thesis. Now, there's a difference between choices and devices. A lot of students use devices. So like in your example, you said the writer uses imagery. If you said the writer uses imagery and repetition, yes, that's defensible. I encourage my students to use stronger verbs, but I still want them to say what the writer is doing. So if I said something like, the like FDR creates a common enemy and then rallies the crowd in order to convince Congress to blah blah blah, then yes, like I would expect to see a paragraph about creating a common enemy and rallying the crowd. Those would be my main ideas. Those would be the choices that would create the line of reasoning. Absolutely. But could I say FDR uses harsh diction and patriotic diction in order to achieve his purpose? Yes. Then same thing. Like those, you could look at it different ways, but yes, you want to have the choices in your thesis somehow. I recommend trying to use stronger verbs if you can instead of nouns, but nouns are totally fine. But that's what they look for. To be defensible, you have to have rhetorical choices in some way. And then I tell my students to also mention, I use the acronym MAP, which I know it has other meanings, but message, argument, purpose, because your prompt is going to ask about one of those three things, guaranteed. Starting in 2020, it has to say message, argument, or purpose. And they may or may not tell you what the message, argument, or purpose is in the prompt. If they do, use your own words as best you can. But if they don't, if they just say like, how does the writer make rhetorical choices to achieve their purpose? Tell us what the purpose is. Like they make this choice and this choice in order to, and tell us what the purpose is. That's going to make a stronger thesis. But yes, you do need the choices in there. But yeah, some teachers have students use the devices, which are the nouns. Other teachers have students use the verbs. I tend to like to see the verbs, but like the nouns are fine. Like if someone wrote a thesis that said the writer uses logos, ethos, and pathos, that might not be a very strong thesis in my opinion, but it would get the point. So yeah. And I do have, if you want to see some examples, I do have a thesis statement playlist on my channel. And I also have some videos, some different videos about thesis statements too. So it sounds like what the author is doing is more important than identifying the rhetorical strategy. Overall, yes, because it's going to help you have stronger analysis, if that makes sense. So they used to put rhetorical devices or strategies in the prompt, and then they changed it to choices. And choices is more about what they're doing. So for instance, like I've had students read some older prompts like, is it Lord Chesterfield? No, that's a different one. Samuel. There's one, I can't think of the author. He writes this rejection letter. Like basically this person asks him to recommend her son for college, and it's like the 1500s or something, 1700s, whatever. And he basically is like, no, I don't even know your kid. I can't. But like there's 3 paragraphs. It's a short passage, but like in paragraph 1, he kind of like politely explains why he can't. And then, that kind of thing. And so like when students read that passage, and it was on the exam a long time ago, they're like, oh, well, I don't see any repetition, or I don't see any, I don't know, contrast. But like, if I just ask you, what is he doing in each of the paragraphs, you could tell me like, oh, he's politely rejecting her. He's explaining why he can't do it. So those count as choices as well. So choices is actually more helpful to students because it's broader. So more things count as a choice. Do you suggest using choices in the thesis or a combination of choices and strategies? I would say keep it consistent. So if you're going to use nouns, use nouns. If you're going to use verbs for like parallel structure purposes. But if you can use verbs, if that makes sense. Like I just think verbs are stronger. But quite frankly, you get 1 point for a defensible thesis, and it could be a weak defensible thesis and gets 1 point. It could be the best thesis I've ever read and it still gets 1 point. So the stronger, if you're looking to focus on a stronger writing style, then I would try to work on verbs and keep it consistent. And a lot of the nouns you can turn into a verb, if that makes sense. So like instead of saying uses diction, okay, we could say like includes patriotic diction. Or we could say like instead of like repeats, instead of like uses repetition, we could say like repeats, I don't know, like repeats patriotic phrases, things like that. Or instead of saying like uses comparison, he compares this and this. So there are ways to kind of take the noun and turn it into a verb. It doesn't always work exactly. Like anecdote is like a short story. There's no verb for that. But what you could do is you could say like recalls a time when, or reminisces on, something like that. And that implies that it's an anecdote, if that makes sense. So yeah. But yeah, there's lots of ways for it to be defensible. But if we're talking about what leads to better writing in general, then try for those rhetorically accurate verbs. Let's see. I just want to make sure I didn't skip any comments. If I like clearly skipped over your comment, please don't take offense to it. Please feel free to just ask it again, because sometimes it's harder for me to scroll. I so appreciate the likes on the live, by the way. Thank you so much for that. And I got a rose earlier too. That was exciting. That was my first one. So thank you. So is it necessary to use a strategy in the body or just discuss what the author is doing? Okay, so good question. You want to make sure that you have clear main ideas. So you're going to have to talk about what they're doing, and what they're doing might be the strategy, if that makes sense. So like each body paragraph needs its own main idea, and we want it to relate to the thesis. But like let's say you want to talk about repetition, right? Which is like for the purposes of today, it's a device. Okay. As you're talking about repetition, you also might bring up word choice because you're going to tell us what they're repeating, like what word or phrase and why. So like if the person's using the word we constantly, why we? Well, are they trying to unite themselves with the crowd? Great. Why are they trying to do that? So if your topic is repetition, we want to maybe see like 2 different phrases that they repeat. So you might have like, here's the first phrase and here's some analysis, here's the second phrase and here's some analysis. That's fine. People do that and they still score well. So it just really kind of depends. And yes, you can combine choices as long as they are related. Like for instance, if you're focusing on repetition, you might also, by looking at the repetition, you might also be looking at their word choice. You also might be looking at tone. My 10th graders are reading Julius Caesar, and if you're familiar with that at all, in the funeral speeches, Antony keeps repeating the word honorable, and my students I asked them like, why does he say it so much? And they were like, wait, is he being sarcastic? And I was like, yeah, kind of a little bit. So like the repetition of the word honorable, the more he said it, the more it was obvious that he didn't actually necessarily think this guy was honorable. So it created that sarcastic tone. So we've got, by focusing on repetition, we could also branch off into word choice and tone and then deepen our analysis that way. So whatever you're doing, like if you're looking at an anecdote, you could still look at the word choice within the anecdote. If you're looking at a comparison, you could still look at the word choice within the comparison. So yes, and if that's what you mean by combining choices, then yes. It also helps to analyze like chronologically. So like beginning, middle, end, or like first half, second half. So if you're really struggling with like, I don't know what to write about, ask yourself, how do they begin? Like, what are they doing in the beginning? Then what are they doing in the middle, and what are they doing at the end? Because analyzing chronologically is going to help your line of reasoning, because they wrote their speech or letter or whatever it is in a certain order to be effective. So if you follow their order, you're following their line of reasoning, and your essay is arguably going to be stronger. Whereas if you just jump all around, then it's harder to follow. Like I once read an essay where the person was like, so-and-so concluded their speech by doing this. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, and then like the next paragraph was like, they began by this. And I'm like, this is so hard to follow, because like, why are we starting with the end and then going to the beginning? So make sure that you're putting it as best as you can in chronological order as well. It really helps with your line of reasoning. Is it possible to get a 5 on a rhetorical analysis essay with only 1 evidence per paragraph? I don't want to say it's not possible. It's not how I typically see it done. But I think it also kind of depends on the execution of it. And it depends on like the choices too. Cause like, but most of the time we see like layers of evidence and commentary, but I don't want to say it's never happened. But I also don't want to say like, yeah, go for it. It's totally possible. So it really depends on the execution. The word anaphora is not necessary, just actual repetition. Yes. So if you, anaphora is a good choice to know, but like instead of saying uses anaphora, you could just say like, repeats the phrase, whatever, at the beginning of multiple sentences. So like, if I read that, I'd be like, oh, anaphora, but like, it's not saying uses anaphora. So just a tip there. Do you think it's better to have a format and list rhetorical devices and analyze them deeper? Okay, help me understand your question, because I want to just make sure that I'm understanding. So are you asking like you have a list and you just try to only pull from that list each time, and then you're going for deeper, because deeper analysis is great regardless. But help me understand your question a little bit better so I can make sure I'm giving you good advice, because I don't want to misunderstand your question and then give you bad advice. Okay, so speaker employs X, Y, and Z to do this. People do that for their thesis all the time, and that's totally fine. So if that was like a thesis statement, that would be okay. Some teachers are not a huge fan of the verb employs, but it works. So that's kind of how what you wrote there is how some people will do their thesis statement. Now, you could also use that same structure in body paragraphs. I wouldn't maybe put like 3 things in a body paragraph though. Like each body paragraph really kind of needs its own singular main idea. Um, but if what you wrote was more for a thesis, then listing the 3 things is absolutely fine. If that didn't answer your question, please feel free to comment again to clarify, and I'd be happy to address it further. For the argument, what do you suggest for strong evidence? How much evidence do we use? Okay, so you need sort of at minimum, I would say 2, because you need at least 1 example per body paragraph. So 2 to 4, because you might want 2 examples in 1 body paragraph or both body paragraphs if you're doing 2. Prioritize things you can write about well that relate to the prompt. So I would recommend, as the exam gets closer, trying to think of, okay, like who are the top 5 historical figures I could write about well? Who are the top 5 contemporary figures I could write about well? Or what are 5 historical events I could write about well? I had my students do this last year. There's this exercise that I did with them, and I would say about half of them said that they used something from their, like, I called it a database last year. Half of them said that they used something from that. I also had them think about like their top 5 personal experiences with like adversity or failure or success, in case they wanted to write about those. So we want to make sure that you're choosing specific evidence. And honestly, on exam day, you might read the prompt and you might be like, oh, well, I could totally write about this instead. But we really want to like use this time right now to brush up on the people that we might want to write about. And so for instance, like I see a lot of essays just in general about like, let's say Rosa Parks. Nothing against Rosa Parks, fantastic person. However, a lot of students, when they write about Rosa Parks, write about her with a very limited knowledge because they just write about how she like gave up her seat on the, or sorry, refused to give up her seat on the bus. This is true. However, like this is maybe not as specific as we maybe want to get. Like they write about history in a very general way. Another one that I see people really generalizing is Columbus, Christopher Columbus. And so like, oh, he like discovered America and all that. But like it lacks like nuance, if you will. Like it lacks specifics. It's just kind of like, oh, I remember this person. Another one was for whatever reason on our state mock exam that we did a couple years ago, we got for the perfection prompt, I got a lot of Edison. Thomas Edison, if he hadn't strove for perfection, we would never have electricity because it took him 1,000 times to get the model of the light bulb. And it was just kind of like, it just felt very like, it was like, yes, you gave me a concrete name, but like the evidence felt like you were remembering something you were told in like 4th grade, if that makes sense. And I mean no offense by this. I'm just saying, like, as a teacher, I would much rather read about something that you can tell me about very concretely. I read an essay a couple years ago for the overrated prompt at our state mock exam, and the student was talking about this basketball player, Russell Westbrook. Never heard of the guy before this essay, but like I was convinced by the end that he was overrated because the person gave such concrete details. Clearly the person was a huge basketball fan. So try to be familiar with like current events and historical figures and historical events that interest you in a way that you can write about specifically. I have a group of kids this year who I joke about. I'm like, it might not be the best evidence, but if they are dancers, and I'm like, if you can write about dance moms and that's going to be the best, most specific thing that you can do, then go for it. Now other teachers might not give that advice, but I want you to write about something that you can write about concretely, like very specifically. And brush up on current events too. Like a lot of students try to write about things like COVID or like Russia, Ukraine, things like that. But like clearly they've just they know it's a talking point, but they haven't done their research. So those are little things that you can do now to get that specific evidence. But as it gets closer to the exam, really kind of narrow down and think about like, hey, what could I write about well? You don't know your topic, of course, but like you can kind of brush up on those things. And if you happen to be taking other AP classes like AP history or something, when you study for those classes, because those exams are usually first, so AP Gov, AP World, APUSH, like by studying for those, you're also sort of studying for AP Lang Q3 as well. How do I practice revising and evaluating each of my essays? It can be really tricky to evaluate your own work, but I would say look at the rubric, which is available online. And if that's a prompt that's been on a recent exam, also look at the samples for it and kind of see where your work compares, and that kind of thing. And just really look for like consistency. I have my students, sometimes they'll color code their evidence and commentary, because we want to see a balance of it. So if you have this like huge chunk of evidence and like this huge chunk of commentary, maybe we need to balance that out a little bit more. We want to usually see more commentary than evidence. I also have them do this for the release samples sometimes. So if you're able to print out a couple, I would recommend maybe just trying like get 2 highlighters, or you can do it on, you don't even need to print it if you can use like Notability or Kami or any of those, but like highlight the evidence and commentary, because usually the lower essays tend to have big chunks of evidence and a little bit of commentary, whereas a stronger essay is going to be like almost like stripes of color, like evidence, commentary, evidence, commentary. So that can help as well. So I have them sometimes do that when they're first learning. I have them do that with like a couple sample essays. And then sometimes I have them do that with their own work. Like I just taught my sophomore synthesis at the beginning of this semester. And so I had them color code because it was just a way for them to double check, like, am I being consistent? And then a couple of them realized like, oh, like I don't have if my commentary color is green, I barely have any green in this paragraph. And then they knew to go back and add some. Or in a couple cases, they're like, I have so much green. And I'm like, yeah, you could probably move on to your next paragraph now. You're good. So that could be a way to help as well. Do you suggest qualifying the argument if you're able to? Yes, if you can. Usually those are more nuanced. Like we want to avoid the always and never, like the absolutes. So yeah, if you can think of a good qualified argument that you could support, then yes. I think the prompts more recently kind of lend themselves to that. But like here's the thing, you have to pick a side. Like don't just, even a qualified argument, you're kind of leaning a little bit one way or the other. So don't argue both sides evenly, if that makes sense. Like, so what you can do is you can say, like, let's use last year's prompt, timely decisions. Well, you could say that timely decisions are valuable because, but then you might want to, and you might give us 2 paragraphs about that. But then let's say you have time for a counter argument. You might tell us, hey, in these situations, you have to do a quick decision, and here's why, and that kind of thing. So yes, I tend to like to see qualified arguments, but that's a more nuanced thing, and not everybody's ready for that for every prompt. So if you could do it well, then absolutely. But just make sure that you have a clear position that you are supporting with ideally at least 2 body paragraphs. Most of my students do too. Do you have any tips on avoiding a summary as commentary? Remember the difference, right? Summary tells like what happened or maybe why it happened, I guess, but mostly what happened. Commentary is why it matters. So really ask yourself, why is this evidence significant? Regardless of which essay we're talking about, why does the evidence I just gave matter? What is it proving? So use verbs like, instead of shows, try to use maybe like reveals, suggests, highlights, emphasizes is a good one. The word underscores means emphasizes. Some people get that confused, but they sometimes put that in multiple choice. So underscores means emphasizes. Let's see, highlights, suggests, illustrates, conveys, demonstrates, those kinds of things. Those can help you talk about the significance of it. For commentary, if you're struggling with summary, use the word because that's going to lead to the why. Sometimes the phrase in order to can help as well. So because, in order to, also use transition words. Therefore, thus, furthermore, moreover also means furthermore, by the way. And then like consequently or subsequently, if you're trying to show some kind of like cause and effect. But those are little ways to help your commentary to move away so that you're not doing too much summary. But yeah, great question. Okay, I think I'm caught up on the stuff in the chat. If I missed something in the chat, please feel free to answer your question again or ask your question again. Because I know there were like a few questions that kind of came in at the same time. Let's see, I got another question on YouTube. Oh, it was just a comment. Hello. Well, hello, Sunny. How are you? Let's see. Okay, so we got a question about like the timely decisions. So saying Timely is better, and finance and tech versus social. Yeah, because that would be qualified, right? So yes, that would be a great way. Is like you're saying in these situations it's better, but in these situations it's not. That's qualified, and that would still work because you're not necessarily arguing both sides. You're just saying, hey, in these situations we should do it this way, or this way is better, but in these it's not. So that would be a qualified one, and that would be fine. And then talking about that in your thesis and intro, yes, to me, what you've just explained is a good qualified argument, basically setting those parameters. And that can lead to sophistication. It's not guaranteed, but it's a more refreshing take on the essay regardless. How do you commonly receive the sophistication point? The most common way for rhetorical analysis is by connecting to the rhetorical situation in a very thorough way. For argument and synthesis, the most common way is situating it in a broader context. If you want more help with the rhetorical analysis one, I have a very recent video on my channel where it's going into how to earn the sophistication point for rhetorical analysis. And we talk about the 3 ways. So the most common is connecting to the rhetorical situation. The second most common, and one that I think works with certain prompts, is analyzing complexity and tension. The hardest way, in my opinion, and the way that we see the least kind of statistically, is the vivid and descriptive writing style. So I still have some tips about that, but it's just like the least common. So if you really want to know about it for rhetorical analysis, then check out that video. It's pretty recent on my channel. And I intend to do an updated one for synthesis and argument as well. By the way, if y'all have any video requests, or if you're like, hey, do you have a video about this? I want to learn more about it. Like, feel free to reach out and ask either on Instagram, TikTok, a YouTube comment. I'm happy to direct you to them. Or if you're like, hey, I searched your channel and I can't find this, like, let me know. And I can do a video on that as well. I have one coming out hopefully tomorrow about my favorite sentence frames for synthesis and argument, because I just did a rhetorical analysis one. And that, if you have not seen that and you're like, I'm really struggling with RA, check out this sentence frames video, because my students have used those sentence frames and that has really helped their writing. I also want to do an updated choices video, because a lot of people have asked, what choices do we need to know? And I did this video back in 2020, like literally the night before the exam, because so many people asked. And I was like super sleep deprived, and I was like hustling to make that video. So now I want to make it like updated and even better. So if you have questions and you want like certain video topics, please request stuff, because we've got like 5 or 6 weeks before the exam. So that's plenty of time for me to make more videos. Let's see. Do you have any tips on how to earn the full points in evidence and commentary? Yes. So to get a 4 in row B, here's the thing. You have to be consistent. And so we want to make sure that your paragraphs are equally developed and equally as strong. You can do 2 body paragraphs. That's fine. If you do 3, just make sure it's consistent. But a lot of times when we see like a 1-3-0, it's because one body paragraph met expectations, but maybe the other one didn't. Like maybe it was close, but it wasn't quite there yet. So if that's the case, look at like, did I prove all of my claims with evidence and commentary well? And then is my commentary actually meaningful? Because sometimes the commentary is really simplistic, or it just summarizes the evidence. Like it doesn't actually answer why. And so that's usually why we're not moving up to a 4. So the key is really consistency to get the 4. And I think it helps to like look at essays. If you can find sample essays online that got like a 1-4-0, which there should be some for the past few years, definitely go look at those. Even if it got a 1-4-1, look at the consistency with which they wrote their body paragraphs. Let's see, we got a question over on YouTube. Let's see. What is the best advice you would give to someone doing a synthesis essay? Great question. So for synthesis, some of the common mistakes that we see are not creating what I call a conversation of sources. A lot of times people try to summarize the sources, or like they have like one source per body paragraph. And that's not wrong, but it's not the best way. So try to come up with 2, possibly 3 main ideas, and try to have at least 2 sources per paragraph. I wouldn't try to shove 3 sources in a paragraph unless there's a reason to, because sometimes that's too much. But you really want to find a couple sources, 2 sources that support your main idea, either because they're both talking about that topic in a similar way, or maybe they oppose each other and you could use that to your advantage. But a lot of times with synthesis, if it's just 1 source per paragraph and then 3 body paragraphs, it feels really disconnected. And it kind of in many cases limits it from getting those higher scores. So definitely including 2 sources per paragraph can be helpful. Remember, you need 3 sources total. So you can reuse the same source in different ways, but it still counts as one source. The other thing with synthesis, as far as your commentary, is you want to be thinking about why does this matter, and think like short term, long term. How does it impact society? That like, why is this issue even worth talking about? And that's going to help your commentary. For your evidence, my best tip for evidence is to look for real world examples. So facts, statistics, examples like success stories or failure stories, and also expert testimony, because usually that's going to help you create logical evidence to back up your claim. So I think you just inspired a new video topic. So I've probably already done 5 tips for synthesis, but I think that's definitely a great question. So I'm going to write that down on my list for more synthesis content, because I really think if you can kind of choose your evidence well and know how to create that commentary, then synthesis becomes a lot easier. The other thing is, when you're reading the sources on exam day, yes, you should kind of annotate in the way that helps you, but be strategic with your annotations, because unfortunately, you can't use a highlighter on exam day. You can, however, have a blue ink pen and a black ink pen. So I have had students tell me that they kind of like highlighted that way because of that. But like, if you start underlining everything, then suddenly it's hard to find quotes and stuff. So if it's meaningful, maybe underline it, circle it, star it, whatever. But sometimes people can kind of like do too much for annotations. I tell my students, if it helps them, to put like a note at the top about like the main idea, like, is it a pro source? Like, is it a con? Like, what's it talking about? Or to make a T-chart on the cover page of their synthesis packet, like in their booklet, because there's usually space to do that, and that can really help. But if you know that you're not going to use a source, like it does not fit your argument on exam day, you don't need to read it, because there's usually 6 to 8 sources. The past years, they've been really doing 6, but they could do up to 8. So if you know that you're not going to use it, don't read it. If it's super long and you're like, I'm really worried about timing, read the first paragraph, read the topic sentences for the other paragraphs, and read the concluding paragraph. That'll at least help you get the gist of it. And then you can decide, yes, I should go back and read this more closely, or nope, I'm not going to use it, or whatever. Final tip for you is for the visual text. So that could be a picture, cartoon, chart, graph, something like that. Schedule even. If it's like source A or source B, because they put the sources in a random order. The order does not matter. If you get to it and it's like A or B and you're like, I don't even know what to do with this. I don't know what this is showing or why this matters. Skip it and come back to it. Because usually if you keep reading the other sources, then you might have a better understanding of the issue. And then you could go back to that source and be like, oh, okay, here's why it matters. Especially for pictures. Sometimes pictures can be a little difficult to analyze. I'm thinking of the wind farm prompt. The first source was a picture. And when I do it with my students, when we do that prompt, I'm like, okay, what do we notice about the picture? What is it showing us? But like on exam day, I would probably say, if you look at the picture and you're like, what is this? Skip it and come back to it, because then it might make more sense. But yeah, thank you for that question. Definitely inspired a video idea. All right, let's see what other questions we have. I am going to try to answer a few more, and then I'm going to unfortunately have to log off because I have a tutoring session coming up. But you guys have had some great questions today. Do you have any tips on full points for evidence and commentary? Okay, so yeah, we did answer that one. Just kind of like the consistency is key. Do you know of any online resources for multiple choice questions? Yes. So free resources. The ones I use most frequently would be SAT practice exams. So you're going to look for the SAT suite. So SUITE suite. You can use practice exams from the SAT to help you prepare. Not all questions are going to work, but some of them will be very helpful. For reading, focus on the nonfiction passages. So like not the first passage, because that's usually fiction. Don't worry about the evidence questions, but the other questions should work. Also, you don't have to worry about questions about graphs unless you want to kind of practice for synthesis. Because on the AP Lang multiple choice, they're not going to ask you about what's the best evidence, nor will they ask you about a graph for multiple choice. But that's one resource that I use with my tutoring students, especially if you don't have access to AP Classroom. The SAT can be great. If you want a full-length practice test, Marco Learning has a good one. It's free. You just have to enter your email and let them know you're a student. It's on their website. I have had students use that with great success, and it's set up like the real exam. It seems very close to the type of questions that you could see. And then also, not a free one, but a high quality one for a good price is the Ultimate Review Packet by Tim Freitas. I wish I had like an affiliate code or a discount code for y'all. They're working on it, but it's, I think, supposedly, but it's not there yet. So, but that is one, like if as a parent, I wanted to buy something for my kid and I wanted multiple choice, I would choose the multiple choice from Tim's Ultimate Review Packet over a textbook. I have not found a textbook or sorry, a test prep book like that I recommend. I've had tutoring students buy some before starting working with me, and the questions were kind of off. So we just used SAT questions instead. So those are my recommendations, both free and paid for multiple choice. I personally don't write my own multiple choice questions yet. So I don't have anything to offer. And unfortunately, because of copyright, I can't put them in videos. So a lot of my multiple choice tips videos, it's kind of like general advice because I can't show the questions. But hopefully that helps if you're looking for some multiple choice practice. Let's see. How often do you go live? Thank you for asking. I go live each Sunday. I've been doing it since January. I will do it through the May test. I go live each Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm on Central Time, so it's 2 p.m. for me. And I am doing 4 lives on the Garden of English YouTube channel. So my YouTube channel is Coach Hall Writes. If you're looking for more in-depth tips, please go over there. I have like 4 years worth of content. But I'll be doing some lives. We have one on Monday, so tomorrow at 7 p.m. on the Garden of English, Tim Freitas' channel. He and I have done this for the past like couple years. We do lives to help students prepare. I will be live starting in April twice a week, definitely Sundays, and then the other will kind of just depend on my schedule to answer student questions. And then for sure, like the week before the test, I'll probably be live almost every night to try to help answer questions as well. Do you recommend Albert.io or UWorld for AP Lang questions? Great question. You just reminded me, I have to look into, I've seen Albert.io. I don't have full access to Albert.io. I've heard it's good, but I haven't seen enough of it to to give you a total recommendation for it. I am getting access to UWorld to see what it's like. So if you come back to next week's live and ask me that same question, I will have a better answer for you. Because this week is my spring break and I'm going to be looking at the UWorld stuff just to kind of see. But yes, those are 2 other ones as well. And I neglected to mention them because I just don't have as much experience with them, but I will be looking into UWorld. We took a mock and they said to read all the text before writing. Weird. Do you recommend that? Do you mean when you say read all the text, do you mean all the synthesis sources or do you mean just read all 3 essay questions? Because if you mean just read all 3 essay questions, I would say possibly yes. That could be good advice, especially if you feel like you're equally good at like all essays in general, because then you could figure out, okay, well, based on these prompts, here's the order that I want to do them in. The downside is that I have had students do that because we do a mock exam as well. And like, I've had students be like, that question stressed me out because I read it and I didn't know what to do. So I saved it for last, but I was thinking about it the whole time. So it kind of depends. Like if it's going to stress you out, then no. But if it's going to help you, then yes. I tell my students to try to have a plan going into it. Like most of my students are stronger in synthesis and rhetorical analysis. So they like to kind of do it in that order. But I have had some students feel like they're better at argument than rhetorical analysis. So they just kind of know I'm going to do it Q1, Q3, Q2. But most of my students just do it in order because that's what they like. But I do think you can be strategic by looking at the questions and kind of planning. That's part of the game plan and so I have a video about that. And I'm also doing a workshop on that too. So for those who don't know, and I try not to pitch this too much because I like to offer these lives just for free to help people. But I do tutoring on the side on a platform called OutSchool, and I have some workshops coming up. I have 20-minute sessions, which are free to you if you're brand new to OutSchool because they give you a credit and all that jazz. Or I also have a few workshops that are coming up about how to prepare, like a boot camp, how to make your game plan. So if you're like, hey, I like this person, I want to learn more from them one-on-one or in a group setting, all that info is in my profile. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. But I try not to talk about it too much on here because I just want to answer y'all's questions. But yes, if you want more help with that, I can help with that through that option. Albert IO questions in general are accurate, but some are ridiculously hard to help over prepare students. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's the thing about the exam too, is some of the AP classroom questions are noticeably harder than others. But that's also why on exam day, you don't want to linger on a question, because if it's super hard, it's still worth 1 point. So do the best guess you can, answer it, move on. If you have time to go back to it, then do so. But yeah, we don't want to linger on questions because it could be just a genuinely hard question. But yeah, if you've done Albert IO or UWorld in the chat, let us know what your experience was. I've heard good things about Albert IO though. We just, at my district, we don't have access to it. But if y'all think it's good, I'll definitely look into it. Okay, so that you looked at all three. I kind of think if it's not going to stress you out, I do think it could be helpful to look at all three, because then you can like decide what the best order is for you, if that matters. Like if you're like, I'm decent at all of them, but I hate this prompt, I'm going to put it last. Like that makes sense. But I also could see how it would stress people out. Let's see. Any other questions? Let me just check YouTube real quick. It looks like we've answered all the YouTube questions. So yeah, I'll stay on for another couple minutes if anyone has like a question. I'm happy to answer it. But just a couple of reminders, I go live each Sunday. So make sure you're following here. If you have a question for me and you're like, oh, I meant to ask that on live, I don't want to wait a week, but I forgot to ask her. Just go like to a recent TikTok video of mine, ask your question. And if it's something that I can do a video reply to, I absolutely will, if it'll benefit other people, or if it's just like a yes or no thing, I can absolutely answer you as well. So yeah, if you have questions that you're like not able to ask right now, feel free to leave them as a comment. And please make sure you're following. That way you can get help in the future, because I will be going live quite frequently before the exam. I'll also be making more YouTube videos before the exam. I have like a list of 5 or 6 that I want to do. And you all have given me some great ideas for some video topics as well in today's discussion. So thank you. All right, any more questions? I know a couple people just joined, so if you just joined and you have a question, feel free to ask. Anything AP-ling related, I would be happy to answer. This is always like the awkward part, is like waiting for a question. Is there always old rating on the multiple choice? There used to be, but now it's not guaranteed. So what I mean by that is, like, before they redid the exam a couple years ago, there were like certain time periods that they pulled from, but now, unfortunately, we don't get to see the multiple choice as teachers, but it's possible that it could be older. But we know that you'll have 2 reading passages, and so it could be more contemporary. Like it could be like 1900s onward one, and then the other one could be older. We don't know. One could be a speech, one could be like from a book, like a nonfiction book. So like it's possible that it could be. If it is old, I would say they probably wouldn't pull anything before like the 1700s. So maybe it's possible you could get something from the 17 or 1800s, but it's also possible that you might not. Those are just, the 17 and 1800s are just harder for students sometimes anyway, just because of how it's written. Do you think we should practice a dual passage? No. My teacher only talked about it a little bit and we never got to practice it. Okay, great question. The answer I would say is no, because they have not done that recently. And they've pretty much said without saying so that they're not going to do that anymore. Now on the SAT, there is like for multiple choice, there is like a double passage, and the ACT does it as well. To the best of my knowledge, they do not do that on the AP Lang multiple choice. There's nothing on AP Classroom for multiple choice that looks like it's a double passage. And also, like, they're not going to, as far as what they've said, they're likely not going to put that on the exam. So I would not do like a double passage rhetorical analysis practice. I just think with what they're trying to focus on more now with like the rhetorical situation, 2 passages would be too hard. to like fit what they're looking for. And they used to do it for argument prompts too. Like they used to have like this person's quote and then another person's quote. They have not done that in years. And all the stuff that they added to AP Classroom a couple years ago that was considered new seemed to be more in the vein of like just one quote or like one topic. If there's not a quote involved, not like differing perspectives. So some teachers still pull those prompts because there's a couple that are kind of popular. But like I honestly don't use them with my students. But the good news is if you know how to answer an argument prompt, even if for whatever reason they like throw a wrench in it and they do give you that, you'll still do okay. But I don't have students practice those. Just because like I tend to have students practice prompts from like 2017-ish onward because those are more current. So here's what I know about the exam. Like they have a committee that writes the prompts. They write multiple prompts at a time, and they usually write at least 5 years worth of exams at a time. And then they might write extra stuff that never gets used. But the reason why they don't show us the multiple choice is because in theory it could come up again, supposedly, whereas like the prompts no. So like if they've done a prompt, like last year was timely decisions, you're not going to see timely decisions again. But because of that, I like to use the most recent stuff because it's like the most recent group of people that wrote it. And so you can, if you look at stuff from like the last 20 years, you'll see trends in the AP prompts. And like the double prompt is kind of an old trend that they haven't done. And that like recently, and when they redesigned it, I think like the stuff they're trying to emphasize is not a double prompt. So yeah, great question. But yeah, if your teacher hasn't really done those with you, that's probably why. So I think you'd be okay. But if you're trying to study, I would use stuff that's more current because those prompts are ones that are more in the vein of what they're trying to do now. But yeah, great question. Okay, I think I answered everybody's questions there. So if you're just joining and you have a question, feel free to ask. But yeah, I've been on for like an hour and 40 minutes. And so I think I'm going to close out soon, but I'll stick around for just another minute or two in case you have questions. If you think of something after the fact, feel free to comment on a recent, TikTok or something, and I'd be happy to answer. And I'll be live again next Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. This week is my spring break, so I should be able to go live during the week at some point if there are questions as well that people want answered. I should be able to go live during the week. And starting in April, it'll be like twice a week at some point. So yeah, great questions today. Thank you all so much for participating and just asking really good questions. If you are interested in any video topics or you want additional help, please feel free to reach out. I could direct you to videos on my channel. If you're interested in tutoring, I have those options as well. And yeah, if you just have general questions, please ask and I'll do what I can to help you. The one thing I can't do is I can't read people's essays. I get a lot of essay requests, but I just can't read everybody's essays unless you're a tutoring student. But if you're like, hey, I just want to know, should I do this or this? Yeah, I can absolutely tell you, or at least advise you the best I can. All right, so I'm going to log off. Thank you all so much. I hope to see you in a future live. And if you're studying for the AP exam, best of luck. We got a few more weeks left, like less than 2 months. So there's plenty of time to prepare. You've got this. Have a